We are glad that you have stayed after this hour has passed by, and we are going to move into a new area at this point. Now, the first problem that or question to ask when you begin to think about translations is to ask the question, what is it that is being translated? A missionary came to my office some time ago with the news that he and his associates were making a translation into the native language where they were working, and he wanted to know whether I thought it would be wiser for them to translate the Revised Standard Version or wiser to translate the King James Version. Well, I asked what was a rather obvious question to me for him. Is there anybody in your group that knows Hebrew or Greek? And he promptly said, well, no. None of them knew Hebrew or Greek. Well, my point is, you see, that it's impossible to make an accurate translation, no matter how good your motives are and all that sort of thing, in this way, because what you have to start with has its difficulties to begin with. You know, there are no perfect translations. As far as we know, God never inspired anybody to do translation. We don't have any information that would suggest that God ever told anybody how it ought to be done. Translation is a human product, and it has its merits, and it also has its demerits as you go along. And so, you see, if you start out with something that's not perfect to begin with, translating it further just adds on to the problem you're beginning with. Now, I would expect that there are a lot of you that have played the game that's called gossip. And you know what I'm about to talk about. You know, here you are in a room with a circle, and the first person whispers something into the ear of the person that's sitting next to him. And that person whispers what he heard into the ear of the person that's next to him, and into the ear of the next person, and the next person, all the way around the room. Finally, you get to the last person, and that person states orally what he heard by the time you got to him. Well, there usually is not a great deal of connection between what was whispered the first time and what's whispered at the end of the game, in this case. Now, you see, that's the analogy. Each translation adds on to the problems that have been made. The more translations that there are between the original and the last one, you see, the more difference there's going to be between the two. We also reason that same way about copying. Now, ancient copyists were careful people. They did their work accurately and sincerely. But copying automatically has mistakes in it. Just sit out on your typewriter or your computer and pick up something and copy it, and then go back and look at it. And no matter how carefully you've done the work, there are going to be differences that take place. My computer has an inbuilt ability to spell F-O-R-M every time that word comes up in the paper. And so I always have to go back and change it to get from out of that kind of a spelling. Well, all this is just to illustrate the problem, you see, of what is it that's being translated in this case. Now, as far as we're concerned, most of the translations that are being made today and have been made in the last generation would be translations that for the Old Testament will tell you in their preface that they're using what we call the Stuttgart Bible as the basic tool that they're making use of. It is here is a Hebrew text of the Old Testament edited by scholars in Germany, and it starts out by printing the Leningrad manuscript of the Old Testament. What is the Leningrad manuscript? Well, it's a manuscript that the Russians have in their museum or library, and it dates about 1,000, roughly 1,000, that's not an accurate figure, AD, It is the culmination of the work of the Masoretes, and thereby thought to be the best way that you can get back to what the text was at that period of time. The Masoretes did their work from about 500 on, and years after that down to 1,000. Until fairly recently, we didn't have any Hebrew manuscripts older than that to make use of. But the Masoretes added the vowels to the text. Hebrew originally didn't have printed vowels. If you went to Jerusalem today and bought yourself a newspaper, even if you read Hebrew, you'd suddenly describe that there are no vowels that are being printed in a newspaper. You can learn to read that way, but it gives some problems to us to do so. Well, today, as I said, all the translations are saying that's what we're working on. We're using the text and the notes, the critical notes of that translation. Now, this means then that there's not a lot of difference as far as the Old Testament is concerned on what people are starting with to do their translating work. You can buy yourself a printed copy of the Leningrad manuscript from Hendrickson's Publishers, which would be in Massachusetts, and it would not have the critical notes along with it that the Stuttgart Bible has. We usually just have an acronym BHS, and people that dabble with Hebrew know automatically what that's going to speak of and going to represent. Now, when we come to the New Testament, we're on different footing in this way. You see, you don't have one Greek manuscript that is being printed, and your work is going to be done from that one Greek manuscript. Rather than that, the Greek scholars have developed what's called a critical text by comparing the different manuscripts, and that critical text then gets printed. You go out in the bookstore and buy yourself a Greek New Testament. It's more than likely going to be a Nestle-Aland text in the 27th edition, or it's going to be a United Bible Society's text. Now, the text is the same. The people that were in the editing of the two down in our generation would be the same group of people. Why the difference between? The Nestle text has a much larger apparatus that is critical notes along with it than does the Bible Society text. The Bible Society text was designed to be used by missionaries to make translations in the area where they were working. And so they included all the notes that they thought would be relevant in that case. Now, I would remind you that that kind of translation has the same kind of problems that we have in English translation. You know, the inbuilt problems are in the translation process itself in this case. I listened to a paper some time ago in which the person that was working in one of the South Sea Islands was talking about problems that they had faced, and they dealt with this story about Saul going into the cave where David was hiding. And they pointed out that in their island, one side of the island talked about going to the bathroom by going to the bushes. And on the other side of the island, they talked about going to the ocean. And so they were trying to make a translation that would be used all over the island with this problem. You see, on the one side, the ocean, they read that Saul went to the bushes, and they knew that that couldn't be right in their dialect. So they knew that bushes didn't grow in caves. The other side, go to the ocean. Well, they knew the ocean wasn't in a cave either. So how are you going to communicate, you see, with these two groups of people using one translation? Only solution, I guess, would be to make two translations in that case. Well, we have then here these two tubes. Now, if you read the preface And you ought to read the preface because there you find out what the translators think they were trying to do. And there's not much point in fussing with your saw because you can't drive nails with it. And you see, not much point in fussing at translators for not doing what they weren't trying to do to start with. You see, you'll find out in the preface what they were trying to do and what they made. And so, if you agree with that, well, you might agree with their product. If you disagree with that, likely you're not going to agree with their product. But now, having spent that amount of time on that question, basically, in our translations, the prefaces will cite these two sources, Old Testament one, New Testament the other, that they have worked from in the work that they're doing and giving to us. There, however, is one exception to that. If you read the preface of the New King James Bible, you will find that these people say that they're translating the majority text, not the critical text, but the majority text for the New Testament. And so you have a conflict of the source to begin with in this case. The majority text would be also a hypothetical text, but made from the majority of the Greek manuscripts that we know about. Now today, the latest figure that I got, which seems a little high to me, is that there are 5,800 Greek manuscripts that are known. That's a little higher than the figure I'd seen before. And so you see many sources, but most of these date late rather than early, in which more copying would have taken place in the making of that manuscript. But these people have printed up a reconstructed majority text, and the New King James says that's what we're translating in this case. Now, I mentioned this to somebody recently, and they came back at me, said, well, now, it now says that it's the Textus Receptus that we're translating from. Well, I can't affirm that because I haven't seen any source that says that. But from my viewpoint, they wouldn't be any better off with the Textus Receptus than they would be with the majority text, if that change is making. You see, the clash is between the critical text, which the Bible Society circulates, and the Nestle Aland text circulates, and this hypothetical text that somebody has figured out would lie back of the King James Version, if we knew what manuscripts they made use of. See, the King James people didn't preserve any record of how many manuscripts they knew or how many manuscripts they made use of. It has been hypothetically guessed that it couldn't have been more than 25. Now, you see, its logic would say that 5,800 manuscripts would give you more information than 25 would. And not only that, but also if these 5,800 included manuscripts far older than any that would have been available back 400 years ago. So, you see, there's the difference. If you're a New King James person, why, you need to recognize what is being worked from in this case. Now, I don't want to spend all morning arguing on this question, but I happen to be persuaded by the critical text people. And, of course, what I have to say assumes that kind of an attitude. People came up with the idea that an earlier manuscript is more likely to be reliable than the late manuscripts are. Now, back in the 19th century, Codex Sinaiticus was discovered at Mount Sinai by Tischendorf, and slowly then became available for study. This is a manuscript dated in the 4th to 5th century A.D. And so, very valuable because of the early date of that manuscript. This present year, that manuscript has been digitized, and now you can find it on your own manuscript. on your own computer, if you like to look at it. Of course, you've got to read Greek because that's the language that's in. We see made available for anybody. You don't have to go on a trip to a museum someplace to see it. Well, we also in the 19th century, the Vatican made available for scholarly study Codex Vaticanus, which also dates at this early period, about the 4th to 5th century A.D. And so that became available and for study. See, these would be made use of in this critical text I've been talking about in the forming of that text. Now, while all that was taking place, scholars named Westcott and Hort came up with the theory that the fewer early manuscripts have a better text than would the majority late manuscripts. Despite the fact, if you're going to count noses, you've got more in favor of the late than you have for the early. And so that's the way the ball bounces at this point at which we are. There was some person in the adjoining city to where I live that wanted to show that I was wrong, and he made a whole manuscript on this point. He didn't convince me, but I don't know how many other people he did. But I don't claim to be infallible on this point anyway. But you see, it is a very basic question that one has to deal with in this whole affair. Now, some time ago, an American scholar who's now gone to his reward, whose name is Bruce Metzger, worked up a book which is a companion book to this Bible Society's Greek Testament that is entitled A Textual Commentary on the Greek New Testament. This book has more than 2,000 New Testament passages that are discussed and evaluated A, B, C, D for the likelihood that the reading is genuine. You see, A would be, well, we're fairly well certain. And you go down to C and D, well, a big question mark. I got an email some time ago from one of our missionaries about a passage in the Gospels, and he was surprised that somebody had told his wife that the passage didn't fit in the New Testament they were reading, and he was wanting to know about that. Well, I just called his attention to Metzger, because here you see you have these evaluated in ways that I wouldn't be able to do. Well, I'm going to drop that topic, but I think you need to be aware of the fact, see, what the translators worked with is an important question if you're making a choice in a translation. Now, also, the use that has been made by the translators of archaeological discoveries that have been made over the last century and a half or something of that sort. You see, the archaeological movement is about that old and not earlier than that time. Now, our Bible tells a story of many centuries ago. It has a culture, reflects a culture of that period of time. And it moves on down to the 1st century A.D., as of course all of us know. Now and then, a translator has forgotten that and overlooks it. If you get your copy of the American translation, you'll find that Goodspeed had the Ethiopian riding home in his car from Jerusalem at this point. Well, he forgot the culture that the story is telling about in this particular case. So you see, you can't have Abraham and Moses communicating with somebody on the cell phone. And you can't have David protecting himself from Goliath with an AK-47. And you see, Jezebel can't send her letters to the elders of Naboth's community by Federal Express. And so you see, the culture has to be preserved of the time that the story is speaking of in this case. You can't have Joseph and Mary flying down to Egypt in the 747. Or, on the other hand, you see the elders of Ephesus coming to Miletus on the train for their meeting with Paul at that point. Now, this has some bearing. You see, you can't have the light in the upper room at Troas to be an electric light. That just wasn't the source of light back at that period of time. And there's, I think, a rather interesting puzzle. Now, as desirable as lights from candles would be in our culture, and as a light source, candles were not the light in the biblical period. The woman who lost her coin didn't go light a candle and look for it. She lighted an oil lamp at that period. And you see, those girls that were waiting for the bridegroom didn't have a source of candles along with them. They had oil for the lamps. That was the source. Outside, there were no electric lights on the streets. People had torches or lanterns as their source of light. A translation has to preserve this sort of detailed culture when it's representing the story. So you see, people did come to look for Jesus in the garden with the torches at that night. Now we do have preserved pictures of the menorah, the candlestick. One of these would be on the arch in Rome that is the Arch of Titus. It's one of the treasures carried away from Jerusalem. There also would be a menorah depicted on the wall of the burnt house in Jerusalem, and there'd be a few others that'd be there. Now, to my way of thinking, it's rather strange, really, that candles have had as much role to play in religious activity over the past centuries as they have, and still have in our present time, when they don't have any biblical basis at all. It just wasn't the source from which light came at that period. Now, also, dropping that point, new knowledge about Hebrew and Greek has come to light as a result of discoveries that have been made in the last part of the 19th and in the 20th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, this fabulous discovery of papyrus manuscripts came from the rubbish heaps in Egypt, where it doesn't rain. So now we have between 115 and 125 papyrus manuscripts earlier than the manuscripts that we had before to deal with. So you see, a person that's interested in the old text would find these of a great deal of value. Within this find would be that those fragments of the Gospel of John that date back to the 2nd century A.D. The Bodmer Library in Switzerland would have a fragment of John maybe dating within 50 years of the time that book would have been written. We don't know the time the book was written, so there, you see, is a question mark there. From this also culture, we learn that the style of writing that Paul uses is the style of writing that people use for writing everyday letters back at that time. This caused students to start talking about the New Testament letters and to stop talking about the New Testament epistles. You know, there's a difference in meaning between those two terms. If I say that my mother wrote me an epistle, what is the nature of that message that came through? Would that be the same if I said my mother wrote me a letter? And I think all of you can see that no, it wouldn't be. The implication is different. The letters of Paul have many of the features of just everyday writing. The letters also would use words like they were being used by people in their everyday communication back at this period of time. So, you see, a person that's going to be a translator needs to be aware of and make use of such material. Now, for the Old Testament, everybody's heard about the Dead Sea Scrolls. So here we have these scrolls that are 1,000 years older than the Leningrad manuscript would be, and would be witnesses of the text at this earlier period. Thereby, you see, a translation ought to at least consider the fact that there might be light on a problem that will be found by making use of the Dead Sea Scroll material. Part of nearly every biblical book has benefited by this discovery that has been made in this way. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls basically are Hebrew. There are a few items in the find, but its value would then be the Hebrew. You'll find a few translations that, at least in their marginal notes, call attention to a variant that might be in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, basically, the Dead Sea Scrolls do witness the same text that we had before. We've been very surprised that this long period of time doesn't reveal any great earth-shaking changes that had taken place. But you see, even small things can be of value in an item of this sort. The meaning of words has become sharper as a result of consulting how they were being used in the new discoveries that are being made. There's one passage by which this can be illustrated. In 1 Samuel 13 and verse 21, there's a passage that people didn't understand in the past. Something is being said about a sharpening process. And the word that's there just has 3 Hebrew letters in it. In English, P-I-M, a pim. Now, since it's a general sharpening process, the older translators assumed, well, you sharpen with a file. So, you see, the translation comes out, the Philistines had the files, and the Israelites had to carry their utensils down to the Philistines to get them sharpened. Well, as this result of discovery, it now would be we'd be convinced that this is not the tool by which sharpening was done. It's rather the price that had to be paid for the sharpening. And you can even find some translations that will translate that into relative modern terms. You know, they paid $4 for sharpening or something like that will be in the translation. Well, you see, all of this new material would be taken into consideration in the dictionaries. We have new Hebrew dictionaries. We have also new Greek dictionaries taking place. And I know this is a ridiculous way to put the question, but let's put it this way anyway. How much value to you would be a book on atomic physics written in 1901 for study at the present time? You know, the question's obvious, is not. That the study that's up to where we are now. Now, if we want to win the 21st century mind, we've got to move into the 21st century. And, you know, there's no alternative to that. Either we drift back to non-relevance, or you've got to be where people are. So, you see, this is saying we're in a better position today than people have ever been before to find out what the book is saying. I'm not trying to affirm no errors at all, but just in general, you've got to be where the point is to do your best. Well, we'll drop that one. Now, our next question is, how do you do translation? Now, I've said already, the Lord doesn't tell us any place that any of us know about how one ought to translate from Hebrew into any other language, or how he ought to treat Greek into any other language and translate into any other language. Now, in times past, without any direction from heaven, people have reasoned that the best way to do translation is what we've come to call literal. So, you know, I regularly get questions, which is the most literal? In fact, the matter at the break period, that's the main question I got, which is the most literal of the translations that are now available for people to make use of. So, you see, that's based on certain assumptions. The chief one is, the more literal, the more accurate the translation is going to be. But you see, there's a fallacy that's built into that. And the fallacy is that no two languages have the same vocabulary. No two languages have the same grammar. No two languages have the same punctuation that goes along. So if you had a translation that was completely literal, you wouldn't be able to understand what it's saying. And it, of course, is only moderately literal that can be made use of in this case. In the translation process, a person has 2 points that he's trying to balance in the air. A magician, with 2 balls, keep them in the air. What are these 2 balls? One of them is the original language that the document is spoken into. And you see, any translation that's not loyal to that original source is not a good translation. The other ball is you also have to be loyal to the language into which you're going. And you see, a translation that comes up, like that one I alluded to in the earlier period, where the fellow says it's a lie, it's not English, is not going to be a good translation. It has to be English that people can understand. And the better that it is like English that's not being translated, the everyday speech, well, the more understandable and valuable to people it's going to be. So you see, these 2 things have to be kept in mind. Now, there are not any actually literal Bible translations that be on the market for you to make use of. So you see, it's which one is nearer to that is all that can be said. Well, you have some interesting examples of where people haven't always come out exactly in English. Now, at the burning bush, God said to Moses, "I'm the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Now, in normal, non-translated English, how many gods have you got? You got 3. The train of Memphis, and the train of Nashville, and the train of Chicago. That type of thing. Well, you see, you don't say 3 trains like that. Now, if God had said, "I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob," that would be English. But you see, the other is not normal English as being spoken of in this particular case. In Hebrew, it's perfectly normal for a person to say that Abraham called the name of his son Isaac. But you see, the English person would say, if he called his name Isaac, what did he call him in this case? If he called the name of the city Jerusalem, well, what did he call Jerusalem in this case? And I'm not trying to say that we can't understand what the other is saying. We've gotten so used to it, we're not even aware it's there. But it's not the way you'd write if you're writing English without being in a translation type of a situation. Well, you see, as a result of this, then, translations kind of divide themselves into 2 groups. One of these is the group that has now come to have the name of formal equivalence translation. Now, by that term, one means that you're making this translation as near Hebrew as the receiving language will allow. You're trying to make it. I guess I could do it. You're asking Hebrew how to translate English. In this case, you see, trying to preserve the most literal rendering that you can in this sort of way, and so that's the way to think about it. Now, of the translations that are available, I think you'd find that the New American Standard has a great deal of tendency in this type of way. The Holman Christian Standard Bible, likewise, goes a long way down this way, and the English Standard Version. See, these are the ones that you can choose between if that's what you want. People like the American Standard Version because you could figure out from that translation what the Greek was that was back of it. I've been a language teacher for part of my career, and I know that the students like to have a pony. That's what we called it. You see, you have something by which you can figure out what was in the original, by the translation that you have use of. But formal equivalence is the name that people make use of in that case. Now today, there's a rival method of translation. And this one came into existence primarily out of the influence of Eugene Nida, who's had a career with the American Bible Society. Nida insisted that the question to ask in translation is not primarily how did the Hebrews say that, but rather to ask how would an American say that if he weren't translating. See, how would this both groups are interpreting. Translation is interpretation. Both of them are interpreting, but see which is going to be the more desirable in this case. Now, this second choice started out with the name dynamic equivalence. And I know that has a name that your mother washes your mouth out with soap if you make use of it. But it now is named a bit different, and so it's called functional equivalence. The functional equivalence is how would an English-speaking person write or say that if he were writing current English without being affected by the way it had been said back in Greek, or on the other hand, this back in English. I mean, Hebrew and Greek in this case. Now, strangely enough, the King James Version had some translations that fall in the second category centuries before anybody ever thought of the name of it, or thought of it as a method of translation. When people in the King James Bible wanted to hail the king, what did they say? God save the king. Well, why did the King James Bible use that? That's what people in England were saying. At the time, this phrase was made use of. God save the king. Now, the Hebrew actually says, may the king live. But you see, it doesn't have anything about God in it at all in Hebrew. Or you can move over to New Testament. You'll find in Paul's letters very repeatedly, I'm not sure whether it's 14 or 17 times, God forbid. And you look in Greek, and you have me genoito in this case. You see, it doesn't have God's name there at all. In other words, people were doing this, you see, long before Eugene Nida ever came along to give a name to the method that was being used. So, you see, today, then, a person has to make a choice in what it is that he's looking for. If he's looking for a formal equivalence translation, well, you see, those that have been influenced by NIDA won't please him in this case. If he's looking for how an American would say it, well, you see, that'd be a choice that you have to make. Now, if we look at those that are available, the New Revised Standard Version would be a functional equivalence, a translation. The NIV would be such a translation. In fact, the NIV itself would be a functional equivalent translation. And you know, today's NIV, likewise, functional equivalent translation. The Message, done by Eugene Peterson, would fall in this way. The New Living Translation, which is the offshoot of Taylor's work back a generation ago, been reworked into a translation, but would fall in that sort of a category. And as I said earlier, no, there's not any point in faulting these people for what they've done if you are persuaded that the philosophy is a sound philosophy. If you're persuaded that it's not a sound philosophy, you're going to be disappointed with the outcome that's made in this case. There's no way that I see which one can get around. So you see, this all says that you've got to decide the philosophy. And then you can make a choice between those that fall in one group and, on the other hand, those that fall in the other group. And there's not much any way to get around doing that sort of thing. All right, so that's the way that one goes. You can make your choice. Now there's yet another issue that's very live in this time in which we live, and that is, to what extent are we to have gender-inclusive language in the translation? I think there's no one issue being more vigorously debated at this point at which we are than this issue. It's an issue that's arisen to the fore in the last couple of decades. Not really been around a long period of time, but very great growth in the last couple of days. Now there are books on either side of this question, and you can do a lot of reading if you want to do it. Now it happens to be that Hebrew and Greek and English, until a few generations back, had gender-inclusive language, but not the kind that's being talked about now. These languages used the masculine at times that women also were included. And you see, if you read in the Bible, if a man kills a man, such and such, this doesn't mean that it'd be quite all right for a woman to kill a man or to kill another woman. See, we all understood that the women were included along with the men in this case. And you might even use the masculine pronouns in such a thing. No, he, his, and him to go along with the man idea. I had a teacher long ago that said that man includes woman because man embraces woman. And that was true back at that period of time. But if you've been in the English course, any college and university, in any recent time, you've been inducted to the fact, have you not, that you don't write that way and you don't talk that way. That this kind of talking and writing is offensive to the feminists. So we no longer have a chairman of a program. We have a chairperson as a program, you see, which can take in both men and women. So back a few years ago, somebody came up with the idea that we can't keep using the Bible with this masculine gender inclusion. We've got to have another type of gender inclusion by which women will be also including in what's said. Now, the way this problem arises, the basics that arises, up to this particular point, English does not have a common gender third-person pronoun. No, you have his, him, and he for masculine, and you have she and her and hers for the feminine. But in between these two, we've got no way to use the pronoun. So, you see, if you're going to have a gender-inclusive statement, you've got to wrestle with that problem that English just doesn't have it. And there's no way to do it. You see, if you turned in a theme, as I said a moment ago, in an English class for quite some years back, you'd get marked off quite badly if you use masculine gender inclusion in this whole affair. You listen to your television. What do you hear on the television? It also has the inclusion, does it not, in the language that's taking place. Maybe you haven't had your attention drawn to it, but just listen on your television and see how this thing is going. So when the new Revised Standard Version was being set in order by the Council of Churches that has in its Department of Education, those translators were instructed that they were to deal with the inclusion problem in their revision. And that's what they did. You'll find that there are many passages in your King James Bible that has the word man, and in the New Revised Standard Version, it'll have person or anyone or someone or humankind or something like that, rather than the word that was there before. And probably people wouldn't get their ire up very much about that if you didn't have to also face the pronouns that come along. And but you see, that's where the rub really is in this case. So what did they do? They worked out various ways to get around the pronouns. One of these is that they recast the sentence into the plural. You see, we do have they, them, and so on. That is common gender in the plural. So you see, you can take a biblical sentence and you can revise it into that type of form. Well, that gets us on to the debated question. See, the people that favor this type of writing say they haven't changed the meaning in making this shift in this way. And of course, the people on the other side insist that they have. You can buy all of the books that you want, arguing the two sides of this question in that sort of way. But you see, that's what we mean by gender inclusion. And you have a choice in the translations between which of these two is it that you're going to be willing to deal with in a case of this sort. Now, that's not the only shifting. Sometimes this shifting is from a third-person statement to a second-person statement. So you see, you'd be talking about you, where the text had a he or him in this type of thing. And I'm not an expert in this affair, so I'm not going to spend all morning on it, but it's a very live issue. And you see, very much reflected in the translations that are now available for us to make use of. Neither Hebrew, Greek, or English has a common gender pronoun in this case. Now, one reaction that I'd have to this is that in the newspapers that I read and the television that I've listened to, I haven't heard anybody being referred to as humankind. Now, some person, something like that, but, they picked out a word that we don't really make very much use of, if any, to try to get around this particular hurdle. And you might find a few others that go along in that sort of way. But you see, if any man comes after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow after me. Well, now, one of the striking things about this is this didn't have any man or woman pronoun in it to start with. You see, it only has tis, T-I-S in Greek for you Greek students in this case. Our translations have been more masculine than they needed to be in cases of this type, sort of thing. But I think I'm more disturbed about humankind than I would be an item of that sort. I just haven't heard that outside of somebody's translation to make use. I know what they're talking about. If you go back in your Bible, there's the word Adam. And Adam has two meanings. Adam is the name of a person. But you see, in the creation story, as well as in the 5th chapter of Genesis, you'll find this word meaning all people. So you've got to have some way to include both men and women when you come across that term. And so there it goes. You see, and of course in all of the debate, you can explain it any way you want to, but woman has never been thought of as inclusive. And the pronouns go along with inclusion. My mind is sort of twisted type. And so in reaction to this affair, I thought about a few passages of Scripture that are addressed to women and whether they ought to be taken as for everybody or not, we might debate about. But in Romans chapter 7, Paul talks about a woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives. And if she's married to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. Now, you turn up for me, if you can, a passage which says that specifically about men. How many of us are there that without finding any specific passage would say, yes, it means men? You see, here you have feminine gender inclusion in the first beginning. If you read in the 7th chapter of 1 Corinthians, at the end of the chapter, you have there a statement about the widow. And you say she can marry whom she will, only in the Lord. How many of us have supposed that also include the widower? That he could remarry if he wanted to. I think I could get 100% on that, but you see, it's not stated that way. Well, that's just looking for something that you can fuss with people about. Take a word like adelphoi in the translations, and what's done with it. Well, quite often we'll get my friends out of it. I think somebody listened to Franklin D. Roosevelt too long, but the fireside cats. But I'm telling how old I am in that. But you see, there you have it. If other places you find that adelphoi would be just come right out, brothers and sisters. See, in these translations, they're usually addressed to brothers and sisters. Now, people are well aware of the fact that you can't have he/she in English writing, so you can't solve the problem that way. But in these, it becomes very, very abundant use that is made of it. And so that, again, would take place in this way. Take Acts chapter 7, verse 30. See, God has appointed a day which all men should repent, is what the King James would say. And, of course, in the inclusion translation, all people should repent. And that maybe would be more satisfactory than some other things that would take place. But you see, the Sabbath wasn't made for humankind, or rather the other way around. Humankind wasn't made for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for humankind. I think I've hit that one hard enough, but how many times have you heard anything like that on the television? Or found it in the newspaper or articles? So you see, it's not that all problems are solved by a decision that has very wide popularity at this point at which we are. No point of fussing with the New Revised Standard people about what they've done, because that's what they were commissioned to do at the beginning. Their ruling body said that. Well, now they get into trouble, however, with the term Son of Man in this case. You don't want to use man. That's a dirty word. So you'd find that in the book of Ezekiel, the term Son of Man occurs about 90 times. This is the term that's regularly used in addressing Ezekiel. So what happens? You get mortal in this case. Ezekiel is always addressed as mortal in this affair. And in the New Testament, you'll find that likewise that mortal has some popularity. And so when Peter comes to Cornelius, and Cornelius bows down while Peter just says, I'm immortal. And when the King Herod has made his speech, that's reported in the book of Acts, the people say it's the voice of a God, not the voice of a mortal. You see, to get around the word man in this case. But you see, if you use mortal for all of these 90 times in the book of Ezekiel, what are you going to do in Daniel chapter 7, where you have all these creatures and one other one that looks like something? And we're accustomed to it being a human form, a man in this case. What are you going to do when you get to the New Testament? You see, in the New Testament, the most common term used for himself by Jesus was Son of Man. It's not used by anybody else, just used by him. You see, you have eliminated any Old Testament preparation for explaining that term that Jesus used in this case. So all that is to say, all the evidence is not on one side in considering a question of this sort, if you really think about all that's involved in this sort of case. Now, there's no doubt in anybody's mind that, of course, the English language is changing. And that means that, to keep a translation up to date, that has to be thought of also, as other issues have to say. If you're not convinced of this change, just listen to your teenagers. And everything is awesome. Whatever it might be, it's awesome taking place. Well, the result of that is that the English Standard Version, no, that's not right, the Contemporary English Version has decided and publicly announced that they're not going to use awesome any place in the translation because they say it doesn't mean anything. See, it ceased to have meaning by the way it's being used. I saw in the newspaper this past week that the Jews have come out with a new prayer book, and they made the same decision. See, awesome doesn't have any meaning anymore, and so thereby it's not going to be in the prayer book. So you see, they're not going to say awesome God any longer. I guess they'll have to. They probably weren't singing the song anyway, but you see, if it's used in that sort of way. But you see, this is one evidence of change that would be taking place. Now, I think this also presents to us an issue that people have to think about. Is there any language in the translation, any translation that you want to deal with, that has words that cannot be replaced? That it must be used without any replacing of them taking place. Now, by logic, if the Lord didn't inspire people to translate to begin with, He didn't determine the choice of words that they were making. Now, we're not talking about the writing back at the beginning. Inspiration of Scripture deals with the original copy, not with all the translations that have been made. If it dealt with the words that were chosen, you'd have to have English words in a French translation, would you not? Because, the words are not the same in the two languages. And that sort of thing. Well, I think we can get a lot of evidence for the change of language. Now, take the word venue. Now, I'm not infallible and not all that widely read. I don't recall having heard the word venue over 3 Olympic Games ago. It may have been around. I haven't checked in the Oxford English Dictionary for its original use, but you see, everything has a venue at the point of history in which we live, type of thing. And again, one that's very obvious to everybody. I'm old enough that I can remember when girls were named Gay, and there was a gay travel service, and there were families that named Gay, but you wouldn't do anybody damage now, would you, for making use of such a term, a word that's taken on a different meaning from what it had back at the beginning. There was a time in which a mouse was an animal that infected your house or came in your house. And a file was an implement for sharpening tools. And on you go, up and down, through all of this type of thing spoken of. Well, you see, this means then that it's possible that some of the words that have become so dear to us in the future might change their meaning. And there might be some other word used. Now take this contemporary English version that I mentioned. They don't use the word repent in that translation. Something like change your life or something of that sort is the term that they make use of. Words like sanctification and propitiation and concupiscence. I can't even pronounce that one, but are those necessary words in a translation, or is there something else that would describe the idea in a better way than that would do in this case? You see, it has to be reckoned with. We have we do have problems, you see, to solve in the general philosophy that's spoken of. Now, the King James Bibles, the line of Bibles, translated Titus 1 verse 16, as the elder should have the husband, or should be the husband of one wife. See, mia gunaikos aner in this case. Well, the new RSV, Revised Standard Version, came out married only once for this phrase. Well, you see, that can be interpreted in quite a different way.